All right. Good evening and welcome to the call, everybody. Super grateful that you're here tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about emotional regulation and learning how to work with that in ourselves. I think primary to learning how to work with that in our children is always learning how to work with it in ourselves. And or at least working together with them and learning it, because we don't always have like the grace of a lot of time on our sides either. And something that I always like to remind people is like, when we're not super in alignment with ourselves, when we get emotionally dysregulated, when we yell or snap or any of that stuff, it really is an opportunity to work through this in ourselves and model how we work through like our mistakes and the things we feel bad about and our remorse in healthy ways with our children. A lot differently than the ways that our parents would have approached it with us. When I talk about things, I really like to go kind of back to like the beginning, where we're coming from as a society and as a culture as a whole, because that goes a lot towards the greater consciousness's belief patterns and the ways that biases might be affecting the ways that we think. It gives us a good picture and a clear roadmap. So, when it comes to emotions, we've done a huge push away from emotions for a long time. Emotions are seen as burdensome, hard to deal with. They're seen as, causing a problem and um, being oversensitive, all kinds of like negative connotations are put on emotions. And particularly in regards to children, we hear a lot of specific things around emotions that are directed specifically at children. I actually remember being a kid and I can hear my mom's voice in my head as I'm giving this talk going, why are you doing this to me? And so when we begin to learn about emotions from a more practical perspective, instead of constantly shoving them down and pushing them away and not really thinking about them, um, if we can embrace them, if we can look at them, if we can feel through them, then we have options on how to deal with emotions. So, interestingly, in order to get a healthier perspective on emotions, I think it's really good to start with what an emotion is from like a basic scientific perspective. Um, and that is interesting to me that I say that, because I'm a very deeply feeling emotional person from a very non-scientific perspective. But it does help us to start here. So basically, essentially, what a feeling emotion is it is a signal from your brain to your nervous system giving you input about external stimuli. Um, and the way that your brain is a really quick processor. It takes in data, it takes in things that it has taken from other situations, and it takes that in and it analyzes it. And so it analyzes it according to our biases, our beliefs, our ideas, our values, all really quick. I like to liken our brains a lot to like a Google processor. When you put in the letter T, anything that you've ever Googled with the letter T, and the thing that you've Googled the most consistently with the letter T comes up at the very top, and all of the rest of the stuff that you've ever Googled, like it's all there. Um, and your brain, it works a lot like that. It's a quick processor, and it's grabbing information and data from your environment, from everything that's around you. And it's sending signals to your nervous system that tells you things like, I like this. I don't like this. This feels safe. This feels comfortable. This does not feel safe. This does not feel comfortable. Now, sometimes that data is tied into a belief system that we have because of the ways that we were raised or the ways that we were treated. Sometimes that data is related to the environment that we grew up in, people we knew, maybe watching TV. Like we gain this data from everywhere, and unless we're consciously processing it, which, like, who's got the time in the world to consciously process every piece of information that comes through our path, crosses our path, all right? So um but unless we're consciously processing that data, then it's just sending these signals to our nervous systems that may or may not be very true for us, as in our values, the way we feel, or how this thing applies to our lives. It may just be related to something that we subconsciously picked up along the way. So it helps us to understand what's going on in our bodies when we feel a feeling, when somebody that we love that feels safe and comfortable comes around us. We're going to feel feelings of comfort, of safety, of excitement, of happiness, of joy, of like connection, right? And if somebody who has harmed us, who has been certain ways towards us, comes around us, all of those other feelings are going to come up for us. The discomfort, the fear, the whatever it is that exists in that relationship is going to come up for us. And um, so once we begin to learn essentially why we're feeling things, um, we get to make decisions about them. Some feelings, um, well, I got to back up here just for 1 second. Some feelings are not actually meant to be resolved. Some feelings, like grief, are feelings that we learn. Some uncomfortable feelings, particularly like grief, are things that we learn how to make our peace with, how to be as comfortable with them as we can be, find ways to honor that feeling. If we've lost somebody, or if a friendship has ended, or, even a loved pet, those kinds of feelings aren't really something that we can do too much about except for be supportive in those moments. But then there's a lot of other kinds of feelings out there, um, that are feelings that are based on what's going on in your environment. And those are feelings that we can work with in ways that can help us to feel a lot more comfortable in the experiences that we're having. Um, Let me give you an example of that. An example of that might be, you're a gentle parent. You're here because you're a gentle parent. So I'm going to go ahead and assume you're a gentle parent. You're a gentle parent because you've chosen to do that. It's in alignment with your values. Most people wouldn't be here if they hadn't made a conscious choice. So I'm going to make a few assumptions. Um, so that's in alignment with your values. It's in alignment with your instincts. It's in alignment with some research that you've done, maybe all of the above, maybe different pieces of that. Um, so it's quite possible for most of us, when we go out in the world, we actually receive a lot of pushback for being gentle parents. A lot of people are telling us that we need to have more control or a firmer hand, or they just can't believe that we would be so patient while our child is crying, and all of these other things. And um, sometimes, because of the way we were raised, because of the pressure that we're getting in society, all of these other things, we start to get these gut feelings, like this discomfort that comes to us that's really making us uncomfortable because we're feeling judged. We're feeling unsupported in what we're doing. We're feeling like people are going to have a whole entire opinion about what we're doing here. And so, when we go to respond to our children with kindness and respect and love, we begin to feel uncomfortable feelings within our body. Um, and we begin to feel things like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this, or who's watching, or all of these other things. And a lot of that is subconscious. And here's the thing about a feeling, because it is a signal from your brain to your nervous system, that's going to manifest in your nervous system. We talk a lot about how our stress, we carry that in our shoulders. And while that is to some extent quite true, those signals, they appear in our body a lot lower down than our shoulders. They appear in our body in places like our stomach and our lower back, and they move up into our chest and into our shoulders. And then when we get really upset, you can feel it move into your neck. And when it moves into your neck, it starts to get into your face. That's when your eyes sting and you want to cry. That's when you're like, you can feel your cheeks turn 10 shades of red and your ears may sting. There's a lot of things that happen to people once uncomfortable emotions get up past our shoulders. So we hold it down in our shoulders, but we've been trained to ignore an uncomfortable feeling when it was down lower in our guts. We would just ignore it and keep going until it got to our shoulders. And that's why we would feel it there a lot. However, once it gets past our shoulders, we're kind of in a state that it's really hard to pull back from. Like if you get that upset that your cheeks start burning, your eyes start watering, chances that you cry or yell or snap or run away or get completely silent or whatever your default pattern is in that moment, that's going to come up for you. And it's going to be really hard for you to make a different decision after all of those like nervous system signals get that high up in your body. When they're lowered down and we can notice them and feel them and identify them, then we have the option to make a different decision about that feeling. We have the option to choose to do something different before the feeling continues to get louder and louder and louder. Or climb. I'm the exact terminology there, but as it moves up through our nervous system, it gets harder to ignore it, and it gets harder for us to implement our tools and make different decisions in that moment. That's why when like it builds all the way up and it comes out in explosive behaviors, it'll kind of feel good for somebody because it's like a pressure pot effect, and they've been building up all of these uncomfortable feelings in their body for so long past all points of what was reasonable that it has to come out in these explosive behaviors. It has to go somewhere. There are things we can do, even like once it gets really high, we can still jump ship. We don't have to like commit to like having a total explosion, blow up, or whatever our default pattern is, right? We can find other ways to get it out of our systems. Things like, there's of course the more calming type of tools that we have, like breathing and visualization and little mini meditations and things that ground us in the moment. Um, One thing I like to remind people is that when the emotions are that high that we're ready to let them out in explosive behaviors, um, active tools like shaking it out your fingertips or doing a jumping jack or putting on some music and dancing, shake that out, like something active that allows that energy to release from your body in a more healthy way, in a way that isn't scary to our kids or doesn't, cause some kind of damage to our environment or hurt our loved ones in any kind of a way, whether that's verbally or otherwise. Um, so there are things that we can do when the emotions get that high, but if we can manage them, if we start paying attention and we can manage them while they're still more down at a gut level, um, we've got all kinds of tools like changing the energy and like just um completely, it's like we're a lot more creative before we get to those states where our body starts going into like a more of a fight, flight, or freeze type of a situation. Um, so basically, I get so excited about this topic, and like I could just start talking and talking and talking. I've quite literally talked about this specific topic for 2 hours straight in the past because there's just so much there. And when we begin to recognize the different ways that it's manifesting in our body, and when we recognize it sooner, our life begins to change because then we can take off pressure points. Um, and there's a couple things that I find really, really helpful in figuring it out. Like, what in all of this is actually me? What in all of this would be like what she was talking about, ideas that I picked up from my environment or from my parents or, you know, so one of the tools that is really helpful in that is in the classroom section of the school website, and that's the values worksheet. Working through the values worksheet is super beneficial because it helps you to see which things might be in alignment with you. Like in the example I used about being a gentle parent and sometimes feeling a lot of like anxiety around gentle parenting because you've gotten so much outside pressure. When you get really clear on the idea that being a gentle parent is something that you're doing because that is a value that you're really, really comfortable with, you chose that. So when you start to feel some of the societal anxieties around it, you can see where that's coming from. You can see, oh, ooh, that came from like directly from my parenting or, from the way that I was parented, or that came directly from my uncle so and so or whatever. And you start to see that, and it becomes a lot easier to walk clearly in your convictions while putting data that isn't useful to you in the recycling bin. And it really is one of the most empowering steps towards feeling comfortable and confident in our bodies to recognize where we are in the middle of all of the things. Why do we respond to things the way we do? Why am I triggered by something? And our values help us get clear on that. Our values help us to understand that we're getting triggered by something because it completely aligns with us and people are pushing us away from it. Or we're getting really upset because it doesn't align with us at all and people are pushing us towards it, right? And then it's so great because then we get to choose to like honor ourselves in that moment and stop doing that people pleasing thing where, we can't please everybody. We're never going to be able to please everybody. But the people that we can please is ourselves, and hopefully like our most immediate loved ones, like our children and the people that we live with. Hopefully we can create a lot of balance within that ecosystem and those structures. But really, when we stand most aligned with ourselves, when we feel like we're in alignment with our own values, even if we fall short, like, for example, maybe racism might be something that, you feel really strongly about, being anti-racist. And you've got that one racist uncle who's always like making jokes at a party and you never knew what to do. You're like, do I say something? Don't I say something? Do I leave? Do I set a boundary? How do I do this? Right. And when you get clear on a value around something like that, you're like, okay, if I leave, that's rude, right? And if I do this, that could cause a fight or a problem. And um, if you're really clear on your value around this, even if you fall flat on your face, you're like, okay, I'm going to say something to Uncle George this time. I'm going to call him out, but I'm going to do it really kindly. And you try, and you just like blah, and word vomit comes out, and you just totally fall flat on your face with it. Even if that happens, at the end of the day, when you think back over that thing, if you really wanted to say something to Uncle George, you're gonna feel good about how that went. You might be like, okay, next time I find myself in a situation like this, I'm going to try harder to not lose my cool, right? But you're still going to feel better than if you sat there listening to something that you really weren't comfortable with, something that made you feel, like this wasn't something you wanted to be exposed to, or something you wanted your children exposed to, and you'd been worried about everybody else's feelings. Um, at the end of the day, when you go home after that kind of an experience, you kind of feel confused and don't really understand like any of it. And like, it's even hard to know whether we're comfortable with our own choices in those kinds of a situations. And that's why for me, like the values was one of the biggest things that like works into learning emotional regulation. It works into figuring out how I want to structure my life, how I want to show up for my kids, and like all of this really great, empowering stuff. And it was the biggest tool to help me step away from people pleasing and acknowledge that my my need for certain things in my immediate environment are completely valid, and that my needs are completely valid, and that it creates a lot more peace in my life and within my body and my nervous system when I'm walking in true alignment to the things that I feel the most strongly about, the things that are most important to me. And a lot of people would push back on that by saying, well, some people's values might be, and I would say for the most part, most people, when they're like leaning into being themselves and embracing who they are, um, even if they're going through a really angry stage in their life, it's not particularly like, it's very rarely like in very specific kinds of situations designed to hurt other people. Most people actually don't need all of the power structures and all of that stuff for them to be respectful in the world. Um, and that's a completely different tangent, and I should probably like leave it here. Although I will end it with saying that, as far as all of the power structures and all of that goes, in reality, like most people really aren't looking at all of what the rules are in order to decide to show up as a decent human being. I personally wouldn't change who I was at all if the laws didn't exist. Like, I wouldn't change who I am, how I show up for my community, how I show up for my friends, because I'm not the person that I am because laws exist. And I know that a lot of people, probably more people, like a majority, it's the same for them. They might do some things a little bit different because, maybe a law keeps you from, doing this or that here or there. But for the most part, people would still show up as decent human beings because at our core, we really are doing our best here on this earth, and sometimes our best falls short, and that's okay too. We can, as long as we continue to work on ourselves and try and do better from generations before and all of that, that's really the stuff that truly genuinely matters. So I'll leave it at that and get to the sharing portion of the call. I'm super grateful that you're all here, and let me go ahead and shut off this recording. All right, so